Hello and welcome to the Coaching Crowd podcast with me, Jo Wheatley, and my friend and co-host Zoe Hawkins.
Hi, everybody. We're here today to talk to you about coaching and interrupting. And the reason we're bringing you this today is it's a question that comes up in supervision quite a lot and is it's a very real thing when you're a coach and you're working with clients, and this dilemma between, do I interrupt to be in service of the client, or is interrupting actually unhelpful and rude? Because obviously that's something I think that we are largely taught, that interrupting people is a rude thing to do. So this question around, is interrupting okay, is a valid question, I think, to explore in supervision. And so thought we'd bring some flavors of that to the podcast today.
Yeah, in many ways it is provocative because when we think about interrupting, I think a lot of coaches will think about, directive coaching and non-directive and think if you're interrupting, then does that mean that you're being more directive? And what does the industry think about, directive and non-directive coaching? And I think our position is it's just not that simple.
Hmm.
And things are neither wholly good or wholly bad. So we'll talk through some examples of when it might be helpful and sometimes when it might be challenging. Even because, so as you were saying, I think we're taught about interrupting as being rude. I was also thinking about how interrupting in some ways can be a sign of being in rapport. So like when you're really enthused about something, or you're both, two people or more are really excited about something, and people are like building on what each other has said, and actually in that situation, people can feel a sense of, oh, we really get each other. This is so lovely. We're all like feeling this similar thing, and a bonding activity. So even in those examples, I guess we're demonstrating that, at different times, it can be a sign of rapport, or it could be a sign. Sometimes it's a sign of disrespect, or sometimes it's a sign of, being absorbed in ourselves more than, let's say, with our clients. And we're talking about coaching here. So when a client is taking most of a session to talk about what they have been doing since the last session, but they've shared they've got a goal for the session, and then they've only got 10-15 minutes at the end of a session, you interrupting could be useful to help be able to create boundaries around time in the session. It's helpful when you have agreed that with your client. So if you're somebody that knows that or believes that interrupting can be useful within a coaching situation, and it may be something that you do, you might want to talk to clients about that in the chemistry conversation around how you work, what are the situations when you might do that, and also to contract for that when you start working together.
I think what you're really talking about here, Joe, is like, who is the contracting in service of? So, who's the contracting? Sorry, who is the interrupting in service of? And what you're talking about there is where you've contracted for interrupting, and you've explored the different scenarios where interrupting may be helpful to the client. You're interrupting in order to really help the client to achieve what it is they've come to coaching for. And there are ways to do it as well. So would you just sort of wade in with, I'll stop you there, let's move to a different topic? You might come in with, I'm just observing that, we've been talking for some time about what you've been doing between the sessions. And I'm also heard that you want to achieve this goal. I'm conscious we've got 10 to 15 minutes left of the session. Like, what would you find most helpful right now? So you're not so much just wading in and interrupting. You're bringing attention to where your client is at in the session and giving them choice around how they want to be able to proceed. Sometimes interrupting is the more abrupt side. So if you've got really strong rapport with your client, and perhaps they have been talking to you about a challenge they've been experiencing, and it's the third session and you're hearing the same things and they're not making progress, and they've told you how important it is for them to make progress on this particular topic, you may use it as a strategy to be jarring in a session and to really bring to attention the pattern that they're in. So you may say, I am going to stop you there. I've heard this every single session for the past 3 sessions. What is your plan? And you only want to do that if you know that in doing so, like they will be in it with you. So you aren't doing it to them. You're not being offensive. You are in rapport with them. And perhaps you have a humor together, that you almost have this contract where you can be assertively playful with each other, because I would do that in a very light way with my clients. And of course, if it went wrong, I would backtrack and I would explain. But you know, coaches know their clients well, and interrupting can be like a wake up call, or like a, oh my gosh, like I hadn't realized that. You're absolutely right. And when you hear a client say that, that's interesting in itself, because they are acknowledging an observation, not necessarily taking something that you have said as absolutely true. So, you know, interrupting can be helpful when done in a more obvious way.
Yeah, and I think the essence of what you were sharing there for me was it's really important not to discount the client's experience. If you're using interrupting to validate what, you know, and hold true to what they've said they want to achieve, then it can be helpful. So if we have a pre-coaching questionnaire, some coaches will have these as a tool that they share with their clients. They complete and return to the coach in advance of the coaching. One of the things that we have on ours is, how do you want me to be as your coach? Something along those lines. Now, some clients will put in there, I can be very verbose. So please, in order for me to get the most out of these sessions, please interrupt me if you think I'm going off on a tangent. Or they might write something like, I want you to be really direct with me. That's really important to me because, and in which case you might explore that with them. And one of the things that might come out of that conversation is, I want you to interrupt me. And where clients loop, like we can all do that. Often clients come to coaching actually because they have been looping in their heads or emotionally for a long time, and they want to break out of that. And so what they don't want to do is come to coaching and keep looping and looping and looping. They might want somebody to, or they may not realize they're doing it, and they want somebody to help them to notice that. And interrupting that looping, whether it's to share an observation or so on, could potentially be helpful.
Mm. I think another place where it's helpful is where a client might be discounting themselves. So let's say a client is sharing progress that they've made, and they might say something, you know, just on the cuff, like, oh yeah, and I had that meeting and I managed to express my opinions really clearly, and you know, it went down really well. And then I also went on, but I've still got this challenge around blah blah blah. And there's a moment in the middle there where they've achieved something using the strategies that they'd put in place. And that could be a moment of interrupting, like, hang on, I just heard you say that there was this thing that you did that you were struggling with before that you've now done. How do you feel about that? You know, so not letting them continue in the pattern that may have got them there in the first place. So that is where I think coaching is a skill that you need to be trained in, because that would be so easy to just go along with. But the skill is in holding what the client is trying to achieve, which, let's say, it's building confidence, noticing in a session the moment where they have achieved something, which is great, but they are still in their old pattern, and you interrupting the pattern to bring it back to their attention. And so there is interrupting in conversations, but really as coaches, we are pattern interrupters. You know, so we're the ability to see what is happening at any moment and to step in with a question or with an observation or with an invitation at the time when it would be helpful for the client.
And I'm just thinking about two things. One is when we interrupt without words. So I was thinking about clients sharing something, and we might make a gesture. You might put your hand to your heart, for example. Let's say a client you can see that something's very emotional or sad for them, and in some way you want to be able to acknowledge that. But anything we do could in some ways be perceived as an interruption to the client's processing, because in a purist sense, if you like, people often have the starting point of, actually, if you are able to sit in silence and be truly present with your client, great things can come from that. So in some sense, everything we do is an interruption. So I offer that as like a as a provocation. And I'm just trying to think what the other thing that came to me there about interrupting. It was about interrupting self. So sometimes that interruption might be you start to respond to a client, and all of a sudden, one of the pieces of information that you've been kind of processing around the session and what you know of the client drops in. And in that moment, you think, no, I don't think what I was going to say or ask here is going to be the most useful thing to do. Or a realization that maybe something from outside is starting to kind of filter through into the way you're showing up, and you might interrupt yourself. And that often isn't talked about very much. And then when clients are interrupted, what can happen if it isn't done well, or it's not received well, or it's not contracted for, is the client can start to think, like, why have you interrupted me? Have I done something wrong? And start to go down a rabbit hole and actually not then be in the session focused on themselves and being able to do the work that they are there to do. And if they have a history in relationships of being interrupted or spoken over, there may also be a heightened sensitivity around that. So whereas with even if you've contracted for it. So again, we always talk about assumptions, but even when we talk about interrupting, I think as we're demonstrating in our discussion today, there are lots of different aspects to it. So when you think you've contracted for the whole thing around interrupting, that might not be experienced in quite the same way for your client.
The question, as we said before, is who is it in service of? So if you find yourself interrupting a lot, is to check on, is this a habit that you have formed and created? Like, you might think that you're doing it in service of the client, but you can't do the same thing each time with each client because different clients need different things. So you may have formed a habit around interrupting your clients if they're particularly talkative, because you might have reflected that, you know, if the client spends a lot of time like unpacking what's happened that week or trying to tell their story, that interrupting is the thing that you do, when we don't know that to be true. So when you find yourself with a new client and you're in a familiar pattern, it's really a reminder to check in on asking the client, you know, what's helpful for you here so far in this conversation? You know, would it be helpful for me to hold space for you to talk some more about that? Or would it be helpful for me to ask you, you know, what you would like to focus on and what you would like to get out of the session? Different people think in different ways, different people process in different ways. You may have somebody who's a verbal processor, and so actually they are ordering their thoughts whilst speaking it out loud, and it can be quite interrupting to their thought process to be interrupted. Whereas somebody else may have held silence for a while and have done some processing in their mind, and then they are ready to give you almost an abridged version of what has happened. So there is finesse, I think, in interrupting.
Well, I would ask the listeners, you know, if you're a coach, maybe you're a manager or leader, like maybe just test yourself to see, can you have a whole conversation for half an hour or an hour and a half, depending on the length of your sort of typical meetings? Are you able to not interrupt at all? Because if you're not able to not interrupt when you've set yourself that goal, there might be some work to do around, you know, what is it that's leading to that behavior? But if you are able to do that and have that discipline, then I think you're better positioned to be able to use it as a skill. And in coaching training, that's what we do, is we teach, you know, people that are training in coaching to be able to not interrupt in conversations. What we don't do is spend time exploring or reviewing in that conversation, where might it have been helpful to have interrupted, and what would that have sounded like or looked like? And of course, with clients, part of, you know, useful thing to do is to always debrief on the session at the end. What was most useful for you today? What could have been even better for you today? You can ask generic questions, but you might also, when you are developing as a coach, which we always are, is to take time at different times to focus in on different skills. So that's interrupting is a skill. And so ask your client about it. Did you feel I interrupted you at all today? Would it have been helpful if I interrupted you? It's, any variation that seems relevant to the relationship that you have, what the client is working on, because we always encourage you to reflect together on how are we doing together in our relationship. Interrupting and silence, very close relatives. And I think your comfort with silence will directly relate to your skill development, if you like, around interrupting. So it might, for some people, that interrupting is because they feel a discomfort with silence. So, it can be interesting to explore what is the discomfort around that silence.
And it's like you said earlier, like interrupting is not just what you speak out loud, it's what is going on in your own mind. So you may look as if you are there and present with your client and paying attention and listening. But if you have going on in your head, what's the next question? What should I ask? Should I ask this or should I ask that? Or, oh, I just heard the client say this and maybe I should like explore that path. Or maybe like you're interrupting the energy flow between you and your client and what is going on in that session. In an ideal world, when you're coaching, your mind should also be silent so that you are present with your client in that space. And then when the client has finished, that's the opportunity for you to form or emerge the next question. So if you're finding interrupted thoughts coming in whilst the client is speaking, then what is that? Is that information for you as the coach to do something with, or is that information for the client and it's information to pass on via perhaps an interruption? So as we said at the start, like, this topic around interrupting is simple and complex.
But we get other types of interruptions as well, don't we? So I know sometimes coaches will bring to supervision, oh, I've got a client and like their phone is constantly going off in sessions, or I feel like my client is doing something else, like while we're in the sessions, or maybe the space that they are in when they're having coaching is a space where you've got people walking behind and you as the coach find that a bit distracting. So those, whether you want to call them distractions or interruptions, are practical things to think about when it comes to organizing your coaching, but also how might you deal with that if it happens within coaching sessions, or delivery drivers are forever arriving at everybody's house, I suppose. And how do you deal with those situations? Do you deal with them as a tool in coaching? Do they tend to happen when it relates to something in the coaching so you can use it as a metaphor? Do you apologize? Do you over apologize? Do you prioritize the coachee and maintaining that in that situation? So there's a lot of things to think about when it comes to managing interruptions in service of the client and also you and your coaching style.
Mm. Yeah, and we're often asked, aren't we, like, do you need to be trained as a coach? Like, I've been doing coaching, is getting a coaching qualification worthwhile? And hopefully today has given you some insight into, the complexity of a relatively simple skill. Yes, it's easy to coach, but there are also so many intricacies. And this is just one simple piece that you bring into, real coaching, very skillful coaching. So we always advocate for being qualified as a coach because it's the things that you don't know, the skills that you haven't yet developed, the insights that you haven't yet got. That is where really the powerful transformations take place.
So if you're interested in training to be a coach, check out our quiz, mycoachingcourse.com, which will help you to understand which level of coaching training would be most useful for you.